Hello, the story I want to share with you today takes place in the state of California, United States, a place of shimmering coastlines, dramatic mountains, and sprawling urban centers. California is known worldwide for its economic power, technological innovation, entertainment industry, and cultural influence. Cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco are hubs of dreams and industry. And yet, as this story will show, even the brightest places can hide the darkest human tragedies. Our central figure is a woman named Jaycee. She was born on May 3, 1980. As a child, she was described by those who knew her as bright, curious, and beautiful in a quiet way. She grew up in a household with her mother and her mother's partner, a man she called her stepfather. The family life, at least on the surface, appeared warm and ordinary. Her parents worked, cared for the home, and tried to give Jaycee a safe and happy childhood. Early in her life, the family lived in a community known as Arcadia, within Los Angeles. For reasons that many parents understand, the search for safer schools and friendlier neighborhoods, her mother and stepfather decided to move. They relocated to the small, quiet town of Maya, about 700 kilometers away. This decision was meant to give the children more peace and a sense of community. In the years that followed, the move would become part of a history that both protected and tragically failed her. On the morning of Monday, June 10, 1991, the ordinary pattern of daily life unfolded. Jaycee's mother, Mrs. Terry Probyn, rose early to head into work at a local printing shop. 11-year-old Jaycee dressed in a pink outfit she loved, a small comfort and a small sign of childhood normalcy, and set out on the familiar walk to her school bus stop. The morning was halfway to the bus stop. A gray car pulled near. The window rolled down. A man inside called out, or perhaps simply gestured, from Jaycee's perspective. It looked like someone stopping to ask for directions. Brave and trusting, she approached the vehicle as any child might when an adult appears to need help. What followed that simple gesture, however, was horrific and swift. The man used a stun device, a weapon that snaps and makes a person go limp with sudden pain, and Jaycee collapsed. Stunned and disoriented, a woman jumped from the vehicle, moved with calculated speed, and the two of them lifted Jaycee into the car and drove away. This harrowing moment happened within sight of home. As fate, cruel and ironic, would have it, Jaycee's stepfather, Jack Probyn, was nearby and saw what happened. He instantly took chase after the fleeing car, but the vehicle was too fast. He could not make out its license plate or other identifying information. Only the horrifying image of two people in that car remained in his mind. Running to the nearest phone, he called the police with a voice torn by panic. The law enforcement response was swift. Within hours, the local media seized the story and broadcast it widely. Calls for help spread through the neighborhoods, the town, and beyond. Helicopters were launched to scan the landscape. Police K-9 units combed the areas that could possibly hide clues. Volunteers gathered, neighbors, concerned citizens, and even complete strangers from surrounding towns, joining an increasingly large search. Posters and flyers were printed and posted. Yet despite the rapid mobilization, the first days passed without a clear lead. Investigators relied on eyewitness descriptions to create a composite sketch of the suspect. But those who had seen the abductors had done so under the stress and distance of a lightning-fast crime, faces blurred, memories frayed, and the sketch could not be precise. Still, the town rallied. Tens of thousands of flyers and posters were distributed across the United States. Because Jaycee loved the color pink, communities adopted the color as a symbol. Ribbons and small displays of pink became visual pleas for help that wrapped the town in hope. Her mother, Mrs. Probyn, refused to accept the silence of the city. She organized, out of grief, but also with the kind of hard focus that crisis brings, and founded an organization she called Jaycee's Hope. This was not merely a press release but a structure: volunteers, counselors, fundraising efforts to keep the search alive and the family supported. T-shirts and jackets bearing Jaycee's image were produced, Musicians and artists used their platforms to vocalize the community's grief and determination. The story caught national attention. There were television spots and extensive news segments, passionate appeals from hosts, and an outpouring of public attention. Yet, as the initial flare of publicity settled into prolonged searching, investigators began to look inward, at people closest to the family. When a child vanishes from a neighborhood, investigators must consider that the perpetrator could be someone the child knows. Suspicion, painful and invasive, fell first on the stepfather. He was there in the morning. He was close to the scene. He had motive in the eyes of some to be considered. Police took him in for questioning. They administered a polygraph. The results and interviews did not show signs of guilt. He was ultimately cleared of suspicion and released. But suspicion, once planted in public imagination, is often not so easily uprooted. And his life bore the burden of rumors and stigma for many years. The investigators also turned their attention, briefly, to Jaycee's biological father, a man named Ken Layton. Speculation quickly formed the notion that perhaps Ken might want custody and might have done something extreme. Yet in an unexpected twist, investigators found that Ken did not even know he had a daughter. Years earlier he had had a relationship with Jaycee's mother. That relationship had ended, and the mother had chosen not to name her child publicly. That revelation removed him from suspicion. With no solid suspects and no trace leading to a clear arrest, the case fell into a prolonged limbo. Over time, public attention dimmed. People whispered that the worst had happened, that perhaps Jaycee had been abandoned in some remote place or that she had been killed. Yet her mother kept insisting her daughter was alive, and the search would continue. Over the years, the outreach was tireless. Images of Jaycee were circulated in more than 1 million leaflets. The public and law enforcement used technology to produce age-progressed images, trying to imagine what a child would look like if she had grown under uncertain circumstances. But for nearly 2 decades, the trail was cold. And then, something that had been impossible to predict happened. On August 24, 2009, the story bent toward an incredible, nearly miraculous turn. The man who would later be identified as the kidnapper, a man named Phillips, walked into an FBI office in San Francisco. In his possession was a letter, an odd mixture of religious ramblings and personal statements. He told the agents that he'd experienced a change, that he had rethought his life, and suggested he could contribute to helping others. Alongside his strange missives, he brought 2 young girls. This small decision, Phillips going to the university campus and to the FBI office, would unravel a nightmare that had lasted for 18 years. The 2 girls, paraded along as if part of a public petition or a theological talk, caught the attention of Lisa Campbell, the head of the campus police department at the University of California. She noticed that the girls seemed fearful, withdrawn, pale, and oddly obedient. Lisa's instincts, the sort of intuition born from experience around trauma and trouble, were triggered. She asked for identification and paperwork. She scheduled a follow-up appointment, and she quietly contacted investigators to look deeper into the circumstances. When the researchers looked into Phillips's background, they found a man with a history of violent sexual crimes. In 1976 he had kidnapped and assaulted a young woman named Catherine. The case had made it to court, and he was convicted and sentenced to decades in prison. While he was incarcerated, he met a woman named Nancy, who would later marry him in prison in a ceremony that, to many, seemed bizarrely intimate given the charges. In 1988, after serving about a decade, Phillips was released on parole and fitted with an ankle monitor. Parole officers were assigned to check on him at intervals. Yet despite the supervision, his pattern of predatory behavior continued. Lisa Campbell's concerns received escalate. When Phillips returned to campus with the 2 children the next day, she saw they were pale and anxious. She contacted his parole officer. The officer, stunned, learned that Phillips had the girls with him, under the terms of his release. He was forbidden to live with minors due to the nature of his crimes. The sequence of events set in motion a police investigation that was to reveal how bureaucratic and human errors had enabled a terrible crime to continue undetected. Investigators visited Phillips's home. They found Nancy, his wife, and his elderly mother. They did not find the two little girls. Phillips explained that the girls were his daughters and that he had the consent of their parents to bring them to campus, but investigators found inconsistencies. They demanded that Phillips bring the children and the parents to the parole office for questioning. On August 26, 2009, the meeting took place, and under pressure and scrutiny, the full truth came out. The woman known to Phillips and Nancy as Elisa finally spoke. She had been living under that alias for years. She was, in fact, Jaycee. 18 years previously she had been abducted from her route to school and held captive in a backyard compound, a soundproofed room, tents, makeshift shacks, and a dog pack to enforce obedience. She had been stripped not only of her clothes and freedom but of her name and identity. For 18 years she had been controlled, manipulated, brutalized, and forced to survive alone while bearing children for her captor. The police response was immediate. Phillips and Nancy were taken into custody. When the call reached Jaycee's mother, a long and unbearable waiting finally closed into a moment of reunion. The scenes at the meeting room, the hug, the flood of tears, the relief and shock, are images that no one who witnessed them would forget. Jaycee, who had been a child when she was taken, returned to a world she had not known for nearly 2 decades. The conditions where Jaycee had been held were appalling. Officers found 2 makeshift shacks in the backyard, heaps of trash, a gray automobile used in the abduction still registered on the property. Inside the soundproofed room, the investigators discovered squalor beyond imagination, rotting waste, remnants of makeshift beds, and items that told a story of long-term captivity and neglect. It was difficult to comprehend how a child, young then, a woman when found, had persisted and nurtured 2 children into survival in such conditions. Phillips was arraigned on multiple charges. In total he faced 29 counts that included kidnapping, sexual assault, and other crimes. At trial, though he initially pled not guilty, the weight of evidence and witness testimony was decisive. On June 2, 2011, he was sentenced under state law to 431 years in prison, a sentence that functionally ensured he would never be free again. Nancy was sentenced to 36 years. This legal resolution did not remove the deeper questions. How had so many warnings been missed? Why had the system, parole officers, local agencies, and even neighbors, failed to intervene in time? Records would later show that parole agents had visited Phillips's property 60 times since Jaycee's disappearance. In 2002, the fire department had been called about a child injured at a pool, an incident that should have prompted further inquiry given that Phillips was not supposed to have children. Yet that information did not make its way to the parole office. In 2006, neighbors reported seeing children living in the backyard. An officer spoke with Phillips for 30 minutes but did not search the property. These are not merely administrative oversights. They are human failures with tragic consequences. The state bore some responsibility. In July 2010, the government of California agreed to settle a wrongful conduct claim and to compensate Jaycee with a $20 million judgment. This payment was not merely a sum of money. It was a recognition by state agencies that the system had failed, that the supervision of a dangerous offender had been insufficient, and that the terrible harm could have been prevented. The police chief publicly apologized. The family pursued further legal actions. The courts, however, dismissed some of the family's claims. After her rescue, Jaycee did not remain silent. She built a new life defined by resilience and a purpose that took the worst of her experience and lodged it into service. She founded the Jaycee Foundation, focusing on support for survivors who endure profound psychological trauma. She worked with therapists and counselors and found a measure of peace in telling her story. In July 2011 she published a memoir, not a sensationalist catalogue of horrors but a careful, brave account meant to share. to heal, and to help others understand the long arc of recovery. Reading the story of the 18 years is heartbreaking. For an 11-year-old, the years that followed represent an unimaginable loss. The control, the mental manipulation, and the slow erosion of self left deep and lasting scars. Reintegration into society was not automatic. It came with years of therapy, patience, and the constant presence of family and supporters who refused to let her fall back into silence. Her process of healing included trauma-informed counseling, gradual reintroduction to social life, and careful, paced rebuilding of trust. The public attention could be both a burden and a support. She had to learn to tell her story when she wanted, on her own terms. In 2016 she published another book, titled Freedom, which reflected her deeper thoughts about what it means to reclaim a life stolen by violence. The second book is a meditation on renewal, the slow work of getting back agency over one's life, the complicated feelings when a child grows up and names the parents who were absent. It is also, importantly, a manifesto for survivors, that speaking out, organizing, and demanding systemic change can reshape the world so that future children are safer. The case of Jaycee forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about society, institutions, and human attention. How many times must a neighbor's call be ignored? How many months of parole oversight can pass without follow-up on a suspicious living arrangement? How do community members balance the privacy of a family with the moral obligation to investigate signs of danger? The answers are not simple, and they require structural changes, better communication between fire, police, and parole agencies, mandatory follow-ups on reports about possible child presence, and community education about when and how to report concerns. At an individual level, the story shows the depth of human resilience and the multiple faces of healing. It underscores the importance of trauma-informed care. Practitioners who specialize in prolonged captivity describe the psychological strategies survivors adopt to endure dissociation as a survival mechanism. The adoption of false identities under coercion, forming protective attachments even to abusers as a way to survive. Healing from such wounds requires specialized interventions, long-term psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy adapted for trauma, family therapy to rebuild trust, and sometimes medication to manage anxiety or depression. In a public sense, communities need resources to support survivors, legal assistance, secure housing, vocational training, and support groups. For many who followed the case, Jaycee's survival and eventual rescue fostered a mixture of relief and outrage. People praised the community members, neighbors, the campus policeman Lisa Campbell, and others, whose attention made a difference. They also criticized the structural failures that allowed the abuse to continue. The settlement, the court rulings, and the heavy sentences were vital for accountability, but they could not erase the years stolen from a child. Through her foundation, Jaycee has worked to educate the public on red flags and on what to do when you suspect abuse. She has advocated for legislative changes intended to close the loopholes that parole systems sometimes leave. Her talks have been direct and heartfelt. She speaks about her life not to extract pity but to empower, to tell other survivors they are not alone, to remind authorities that vigilance matters, and to urge communities to act when something doesn't feel right. In the years since rescue, the family continued their private work, rebuilding relationships, supporting the children, now young women, born in captivity, and finding ways to normalize life where possible. They celebrated small victories, a birthday party in sunlight, a garden planted together, a walk in a grocery store without fear. These ordinary moments, to many of us, are mundane. For survivors of long captivity, each small, ordinary moment carries the weight of triumph. There is, too, an ongoing national conversation about how to prevent future tragedies. Some advocate for more rigorous parole enforcement and for better data sharing among agencies. Others emphasize community training programs, teaching citizens to notice and report suspicious patterns without shaming families. Technological solutions, better cross-agency databases, improved tracking of parole compliance, and mandatory flagging of referrals can help plug holes. But technology without compassion is not enough. It must be matched by a cultural willingness to question and intervene carefully and decisively. When we close the chapter on the factual recounting of events, it is important to remember that the human story continues. Jaycee's books, her foundation, and her interviews are part of a broader societal attempt to turn pain into meaning. Her testimony has helped some lawmakers and organizations redraw policies on supervision and reporting. Her children have had complex journeys themselves. As adults, they face the choices of how much to reclaim from a childhood they barely had and how much to shape their own futures. The entire case also reminds us that heroes are often ordinary people who notice unusual things and act. Lisa Campbell, who saw two pale, fearful girls and had questions, she acted. Neighbors who persisted with reports acted. The single detective who pursued an unusual lead acted. Their collective actions, however small they seemed at the time, combined to free one woman and her children from a life of bleak constraint. To end, it is worth reflecting on the resilience of the human spirit and the need for systems to be better. Change requires both people who refuse to let another's suffering remain invisible, and institutions willing to respond with speed and compassion. Jaycee's story is a testimony to survival and to the long, patient work of recovery. It is also a cautionary tale that when communities, agencies, or individuals fail to connect the dots, someone pays the cost. If you remember one thing from this story, let it be this: vigilance matters, not in a way that breeds suspicion for suspicion's sake, but in a way that insists we pay attention to each other. When someone's behavior seems off, when a child appears withdrawn or fearful, when neighbors report strange sounds or an odd living arrangement, those observations matter and can save lives. This account draws on the experiences reported by survivors, the facts of legal proceedings, and the actions of the dedicated investigators and community members who refused to give up. I have chosen to tell it with care and attention, to honor the dignity of those involved, and to preserve the truth while avoiding sensationalism. Thank you for listening. This video ends here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video. Goodbye.